Tonight, we are traveling back hundreds of thousands of years to an era when the human story had not settled on one survivor. One branch of our family tree began to narrow. For most of Earth's history, humanity was not a single story moving forward, but many stories unfolding at once. Early human populations spread widely, adapting through movement and flexibility rather than permanence. Genetic differences were small, fluid, and constantly reshaped by migration and mixing across vast landscapes. Then the climate began to waver. Cooling and warming cycles repeated again and again, pressing on bodies, behaviors, and survival strategies. Some groups followed the shifting environments. Others remained, facing colder regions where endurance mattered more than speed and strength mattered more than reach. As isolation deepened, separation quietly altered the path. Small populations changed faster than large ones, guided by chance as much as necessity. Over long stretches of time, bodies began to change. Heavier builds, shorter limbs, greater muscle mass, not as improvements, but as responses to repeated stress. Adaptation solved immediate problems, and slowly it reduced the number of available futures. But why did one human lineage become so narrowly adapted? What pushed their evolution towards strength and cold at the cost of flexibility? How did survival pressure reshape them over hundreds of thousands of years? And why did that path appear to work for so long? Tonight, we trace the slow narrowing of a human possibility. But before we begin, if this gentle journey is already easing your thoughts, you're in the right place. A soft tap on the like button or a quiet subscription helps this little corner of calm continue to exist, and it means more than you might think. And if you're feeling cozy, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's always comforting to see how far these quiet stories travel. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders loosen, and together, let us step back into the fragile moment when humanity almost became something else. Long before names hardened into categories, the human presence on Earth moved like a soft current across the land. Small groups traveled through open plains, wooded corridors, and shifting coastlines, leaving little behind but footprints and familiar paths. Their lives were shaped less by staying than by going, guided by seasons, animals, and the quiet knowledge of where food could be found when the land changed its mind. These early humans were not built for a single place. Their bodies carried proportions that worked well enough almost anywhere, neither heavy nor slight, balanced rather than extreme, limbs suited for distance, hands shaped for varied tasks, faces that bore no strong signature of cold or heat. Survival rested on adaptability, not commitment. When conditions shifted, movement was the response, and with movement came connection. Groups met, separated, and met again, sharing skills, mates, and stories in ways that kept boundaries loose and permeable. Across these broad landscapes, genetic differences remained subtle. Variation existed, as it always does, but it flowed gently through populations rather than pooling in isolated pockets. Traits rose and fell in frequency as people moved and mixed, never settling long enough to harden into something fixed. What defined humanity at this stage was not distinction, but continuity, a web of related lives stretching across regions without sharp edges. This flexibility shaped behavior as much as biology. Tools were simple and adaptable, used where needed, and left behind when circumstances changed. Diets shifted with availability, broad rather than narrow, reflecting an ability to take advantage of what each environment offered. Knowledge traveled with people, carried in memory rather than carved into place. The world was not yet divided into territories that demanded loyalty, but into roots that encouraged return. Importantly, there was no single direction pulling these populations apart. The future Neanderthal lineage and other human lines existed as possibilities rather than destinies, their differences not yet written into bone or habit. Any individual born in one region could have moved into another and blended seamlessly into a neighboring group. The idea of separation had not yet taken hold, either geographically or biologically. This shared beginning was defined by openness. Humanity existed as a moving network, resilient because it did not rely on one solution for survival. Strength, speed, endurance, and cleverness all mattered, but none were pushed to an extreme. Balance held the advantage, allowing populations to persist across uncertainty without becoming bound to a single way of living. In this early chapter, human history remained wide, paths had not narrowed, and futures had not been closed. What would later appear as distinct branches were still joined at the trunk, drawing from the same deep roots. The story had not yet chosen a direction, and humanity for a time remained wonderfully unresolved. The land itself began to hesitate. Seasons no longer followed familiar rhythms, and long stretches of warmth gave way to creeping cold, only to retreat again. Over tens of thousands of years, these shifts repeated, not as single dramatic events, but as a restless pattern of advance and withdrawal. Glaciers edged forward, then softened their grip. Forests thinned, returned, and thinned again. The world learned how to change its mind. For early human populations, this instability became a constant presence rather than a temporary challenge. Survival no longer depended only on finding food or shelter, but on enduring unpredictability itself. Traits that worked well in steady environments now faced repeated testing. Endurance mattered when winters lingered. Fat storage helped when resources faltered. Bodies that conserved heat performed better when cold returned sooner than expected. None of this reflected foresight or refinement. It was simply the quiet sorting that occurs when conditions refuse to stay still. Some groups responded through movement, drifting with the changing climate and maintaining access to familiar resources. Others remained closer to colder regions, whether by geography or circumstance. For these populations, retreat was not always possible. Ice and open steppe reshaped daily life, pressing heavily on physiology and behavior alike. Cold demanded thicker bodies, shorter extremities, and a metabolism capable of sustaining warmth over long, lean seasons. These were not choices, but consequences. Environmental instability also narrowed options. In fluctuating climates, reliability often outweighed versatility. Strategies that worked consistently, even if limited, offered steadier survival than those requiring frequent adjustment. Over time, this favored traits that performed well under repeated cold stress, reinforcing them each time the climate swung back toward harsher conditions. Evolution responded not to what was ideal, but to what endured. Importantly, this divergence was not guided by intellect or ingenuity. Cognitive ability existed across human populations, shared and varied without clear hierarchy. The shaping force was external, applied again and again through temperature, landscape, and resource distribution. Climate set the terms, and bodies adjusted as they could. Where the cold persisted longest, physical adaptation carried more weight than behavioral flexibility alone. As cycles repeated, populations exposed to similar pressures began to resemble one another more closely, while drifting away from those living under different conditions. This separation did not happen suddenly. It accumulated quietly, layer upon layer, as each climatic swing favored the same responses. The environment remembered what worked and asked for it again. In this way, instability became a kind of guide, not directing progress, but reinforcing familiarity. What survived one cold period was more likely to survive the next, and traits suited to these conditions gradually became more common. Divergence emerged not from innovation, but from repetition. The human story, once wide and fluid, began to feel the first subtle currents of constraint. Climate did not create intelligence, nor did it reward cleverness alone. It pressed, retreated, and pressed again, slowly shaping different paths from the same shared beginning. Distance did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, measured in missed encounters and paths no longer crossed. Rivers shifted their courses, ice interrupted familiar routes, and changing landscapes made return journeys less likely. Over time, spaces opened between human groups, not dramatic gaps, but enough to thin the threads that once connected them. Separation began as absence, then settled into routine. As contact faded, so did the steady exchange of genes. When groups met less often, traits circulating within one population became less common in another. What had once flowed freely now lingered locally. This was not an active process, nor a deliberate turning away. It was simply what happened when movement slowed and familiarity with distant groups diminished. Genetic mixing did not stop, but it weakened, and in that weakening, differences found room to grow. Population size quietly shaped the pace of change. Large groups carried diversity like a buffer, softening the effects of chance. Small groups did not have that luxury. In them, random variation mattered more. A trait could become common not because it was better, but because the individuals carrying it happened to survive, reproduce, and remain close to one another. Over generations, this randomness left a visible imprint. This process is often called genetic drift, though it feels less like motion and more like settling. In small, isolated populations, the genetic makeup can shift simply through repetition and loss. Certain traits linger by coincidence, others disappear without consequence. No guiding force directs this outcome. It unfolds quietly, shaped by numbers rather than necessity. Isolation magnified these effects. With fewer newcomers arriving, each generation inherited a narrower slice of variation. Even traits with little relevance to survival could become characteristic over time. The population began to reflect its own recent history more than the broader human story. Change accelerated, not because life moved faster, but because fewer alternatives remained. Behavior followed a similar path. Habits and traditions reinforced themselves within small groups, repeated because they were known rather than because they were optimal. Without frequent interaction across populations, ways of living became more distinct even when environments overlapped. Isolation shaped not only bodies, but expectations. Importantly, this was not a separation defined by ability or insight. Intelligence, creativity, and social depth existed on all sides of these growing distances. What differed was exposure. Groups shaped primarily by one another began to carry their differences forward, not realizing they were diverging from others living beyond their immediate reach. Over long spans of time, isolation proved powerful. It did not invent new traits so much as amplify existing ones. It turned small variations into signatures and chance into pattern. Humanity, once a wide and interwoven presence, began to feel the subtle pull of separation, not through intention, but through the quiet mathematics of distance and number. The human path started to bend. Change arrived without announcement. It did not reshape bodies within a lifetime, nor did it announce itself through sudden difference. Instead, it moved across generations, like a faint pressure, barely noticeable in any single moment. Children resembled their parents. Parents resembled those before them, and only across deep time did the outline begin to shift. Cold environments place specific demands on the human form. Heat was precious, energy costly, recovery slow. Bodies that held warmth more efficiently endured longer through lean seasons. Gradually, frames grew denser, limbs shortened, reducing the surface through which heat could escape. Torsos thickened, muscle mass increased, not for display or dominance, but for endurance. Each adjustment was modest on its own, yet persistent across thousands of years. These shifts were not responses to a single winter or a single harsh landscape. They unfolded through repetition. Each return of cold favored similar traits, reinforcing what already existed rather than inventing something new. A slightly broader chest, a slightly heavier build, a slightly stronger grip could mean the difference between lasting through scarcity or failing quietly. Over time, these small advantages accumulated, not as progress, but as stability. Importantly, nothing about these changes suggested superiority. They were not improvements in an absolute sense, only solutions to immediate physical problems. Strength mattered where fuel was costly. Compactness mattered where warmth slipped away easily. In different conditions, these same traits could become burdens rather than benefits. The body responded not to an ideal, but to a specific set of constraints. This transformation also respected patience. Evolution did not rush. Generations passed before differences became noticeable, and many changes remained subtle even then. There was no moment when a body became something else. Instead, there was continuity, the present always tethered closely to the past. Bones thickened fractionally, muscles attached a little more robustly, proportions edged toward efficiency without crossing any sharp boundary. Daily life reinforced these forms. Tasks demanded sustained effort rather than bursts of speed. Carrying, holding, resisting cold, and enduring repetition favored strength over lightness. Bodies adapted to what they were asked to do most often, and in doing so, they reflected the environments that shaped them. The landscape wrote itself into muscle and bone, one generation at a time. These emerging physical traits did not define identity, nor did they separate one population cleanly from another. They represented tendencies, not rules. Variation persisted within groups, and overlap remained extensive. Yet across time, patterns grew clearer. Where cold lingered longest, bodies carried its signature more deeply. This was not a turning point marked by transformation, but a quiet alignment between form and place. Humanity remained human, adaptable and familiar, even as its outlines slowly shifted. The body began to tell a local story, shaped by practicality, patience, and the steady influence of cold. Cold did more than shape bodies. It quietly reshaped the balance between energy taken in and energy spent, turning daily survival into a careful calculation. In warmer landscapes, shortfalls could be endured, compensated by movement or variety. In colder regions, the margin thinned. Heat had to be produced constantly, muscles fed regularly, and recovery allowed no long interruptions. Calories became more than nourishment. They became stable. Maintaining warmth demanded fuel even at rest. Dense muscle required ongoing support, and larger bodies consumed energy simply by existing. Each day carried a baseline cost that could not be ignored, regardless of success or failure in the hunt. This changed the rhythm of life. Survival no longer hinged on occasional abundance, but on steady intake. A missed opportunity carried weight forward, echoing through the next days and weeks. As a result, food strategies grew more focused. High energy resources became essential, not optional. Animal protein and fat, offered dependable returns, compact and efficient in a way scattered plant foods could not always provide in cold seasons. Hunting was not just a skill, but a necessity reinforced by the environment. The landscape itself narrowed what contemplatable choices looked like. With this dependence came constraint. Certain prey, certain routes, certain seasonal patterns became deeply familiar. Knowledge grew precise, rooted in repeated success rather than broad experimentation. This was not stagnation, but reliability. When the cost of failure was high, flexibility yielded to consistency. Over time, these strategies reinforced themselves, shaping behavior as surely as climate shaped bone. Energy demands also influenced movement. Long migrations grew costly, not impossible, but risky. Carrying a large, fuel hungry body across uncertain terrain required confidence in what lay ahead. Staying within known ranges reduced that risk. Familiar landscapes offered predictable resources and tested pathways, while distant possibilities carried unknown costs. Gradually, rootedness became safer than roaming. This narrowing was subtle. Options did not vanish overnight. They faded in priority, used less often, remembered less clearly. Each generation learned the same dependable patterns because those patterns worked. Over many generations, this repetition became an expectation. Diets stabilized, territories solidified, and innovation focused on improving existing strategies rather than seeking alternatives. Importantly, this was not a failure of ingenuity or curiosity. Cognitive potential remained rich, problem solving remained present. What changed was the environment's tolerance for risk. Cold rewarded efficiency and penalized exploration. Energy budgets left little room for trial and error, favoring what had proven itself repeatedly. As food strategies locked into place, so did futures. Survival success reinforced a narrow set of behaviors, and those behaviors fed back into biology, supporting bodies built for sustained effort and steady intake. The loop tightened gently but persistently. Life continued, effective and resilient within its limits, yet increasingly committed to a specific way of being. In the quiet arithmetic of calories and cold, humanity began to feel another boundary forming. Not imposed by intention, but by necessity, the range of viable choices slowly contracted, shaping a lineage that endured by staying well fed, well practiced, and closely aligned with the demands of its world. Inside the shelter of the skull, change followed a quieter path, but no less demanding. As bodies adjusted to cold and routines tightened around survival, the brain also responded to the pressures of an unforgiving environment, not through sudden expansion, but through gradual investment, shaped by the same forces that favored endurance, coordination, and careful attention to the world at close range. Life in harsh climates requires constant awareness, tracking prey across open ground, remembering seasonal patterns, maintaining tools, and coordinating closely with others place steady demands on perception and memory. Social bonds mattered deeply, as cooperation reduced individual risk. Over long spans of time, these conditions favored brains capable of sustaining complex tasks for extended periods. Size increased slowly, generation by generation, not as an achievement, but as a reflection of what daily survival quietly required. Yet a larger brain did not automatically confer superiority. Intelligence is not measured by volume alone, and capacity does not guarantee advantage in every setting. What mattered was how that brain was used and what it was supported by. Cognitive abilities remained shaped by environment, culture, and opportunity rather than anatomy in isolation. A brain adapted for one world could become a burden in another. The cost of this expansion was constant and unavoidable. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive, consuming energy even in stillness. In cold environments, where bodies already required steady fuel, supporting a large brain added another layer of demand. Calories had to flow reliably, not just to muscles and warmth, but to thought itself. The mind, like the body, requires maintenance. This deepened dependence on stable food sources. Unpredictable shortages threatened not only physical strength, but cognitive function. Focus, coordination, and social cohesion all faltered when energy ran low. As a result, survival favored strategies that minimized uncertainty. Reliable access to calorie dense foods became increasingly essential, reinforcing hunting patterns, territories, and seasonal behaviors already shaped by earlier pressures. The brain and the environment became tightly linked. Cognitive capacity supported complex survival strategies, and those strategies, in turn, required constant nutritional support. This relationship was effective, even impressive, within its context. It allowed populations to thrive under conditions that were severe and repetitive. At the same time, it further narrowed the range of viable alternatives. Importantly, this process was not guided by foresight. Brains did not grow in anticipation of future challenges. They grew because, in that moment, individuals with slightly greater capacity navigated their world more consistently. Over many generations, that consistency accumulated. The result was a lineage, increasingly dependent on maintaining a delicate balance between energy intake and cognitive demand. This balance worked well for a long time. It supported stable communities, refined skills, and deep familiarity with local landscapes. Yet it also tied survival to a specific set of conditions. Large brains required large commitments. Thought itself became intertwined with environment, diet, and routine. In the quiet growth of the brain, another layer of specialization took hold, not as a mark of advancement, but as part of a broader pattern where success depended on meeting rising costs through increasingly precise means. Tools entered the story not as flashes of creativity, but as steady companions to survival. In environments where cold pressed constantly and margins were thin, tools functioned less as symbols of progress and more as extensions of the body. A sharpened edge, a shaped handle, a familiar weight in the hand reduced effort, conserved energy, and lowered risk. Each object carried the quiet promise that work could be done with fewer losses. Harsh conditions rewarded dependability. A tool that worked predictably mattered more than one that was novel. Stone flakes, shaped in known ways, points balanced for repeated use, and grips worn smooth by memory offered reassurance. When survival depended on steady returns, there was little incentive to abandon what already performed its task well. Reliability became a form of intelligence, expressed through repetition rather than reinvention. This did not mean creativity vanished. Skill remained present in subtle adjustments, careful maintenance, and the choice of materials. Knowledge was passed through observation and practice, refined slowly as hands learned what the environment would tolerate. Yet change moved cautiously. Experimentation carried risk, and risk carried cost. In landscapes that allowed little room for error, the safest path was familiarity. Tools also stabilized daily rhythms. They supported predictable hunting strategies, processing methods, and shelter construction. With dependable equipment, tasks followed known sequences, allowing groups to coordinate with efficiency. Time and energy could be allocated with confidence, reinforcing routines that minimized uncertainty. Stability extended beyond objects into patterns of living. This emphasis shaped the pace of technological change. Innovations, when they appeared, were often incremental rather than transformative. A slight improvement in edge retention, a minor refinement in shape, or a better fitting grip could persist for long periods. Once proven, these designs endured, sometimes unchanged for generations. Longevity itself became evidence of success. Importantly, this was not stagnation. It was alignment with circumstance. In environments marked by recurring stress, the value of a tool lay in its ability to deliver consistent outcomes. Rapid novelty offered no guarantee of improvement, and failure carried weight. The environment set the terms, and technology adapted accordingly. Tools also reinforced social continuity. Shared methods created shared expectations, allowing cooperation to flow smoothly. Everyone understood how an object would behave, how long a task would take, and what results could be expected. This predictability supported trust and coordination, both essential where survival relied on group effort. Over time, the focus on proven tools became self-reinforcing. Familiar designs shaped training, and training shaped preference. New approaches, even when possible, appeared unnecessary when existing ones met the demands placed upon them. The range of acceptable solutions narrowed, not because alternatives could not exist, but because the cost of testing them felt too high. In this way, tools reflected adaptation rather than limitation. They mirrored the pressures shaping bodies and behavior, favoring what endured over what surprised. Technology settled into a form that matched the world it served, steady, resilient, and quietly effective, sustaining life through repetition rather than change. The landscape no longer favored lightness. Open ground, cold air, and heavy prey asked for effort sustained over time rather than bursts of speed. In this setting, strength carried quiet authority. It allowed bodies to resist the pull of cold, to bring down large animals, to endure labor that could not be rushed. Range mattered less when resources were concentrated, and speed mattered less when conditions punished unnecessary movement. Daily survival reflected this balance. Tasks unfolded slowly and repeatedly, hauling, cutting, carrying, holding. Strength turned these demands into manageable routines. It reduced injury, shortened recovery, and lowered the cost of each action. Where every calorie counted, efficiency mattered more than versatility. The body learned what the land required and adjusted accordingly. Behavior followed form. Strategies emphasized persistence over exploration, familiarity over novelty. The environment offered few rewards for wide-ranging movement and many penalties for miscalculation. Harsh conditions narrowed the window for error, favoring approaches that worked consistently even if they lacked breadth. Strength supported this stability, anchoring life to known methods that minimized risk. Over time, these strategies settled into patterns. Hunting focused on animals that could be reliably found and processed. Shelter was reinforced rather than reinvented. Routes became habitual, chosen for predictability rather than opportunity. Each repetition deepened commitment to the same solutions. What succeeded once was likely to succeed again, and so it was used again. The environment shaped this rigidity gently but persistently. When conditions change often, flexibility offers advantage. When conditions repeat, consistency becomes powerful. Cold returned again and again, asking the same questions of bodies and behavior, Each return reinforced the same answers. Traits that supported strength and endurance rose in importance, while those suited to rapid change faded quietly into the background. This did not eliminate creativity or awareness, it redirected them. Problem solving focused inward, refining existing practices rather than seeking alternatives. Skill deepened within a narrowing frame. Knowledge became precise, local, and deeply rooted in place. The world rewarded those who knew it intimately, not those who ventured far from it. As strategies hardened, so did expectations. Young individuals learned the same patterns because those patterns worked. Variation persisted, but it was guided, shaped by what the environment allowed to succeed repeatedly. Flexibility did not disappear, but it was constrained, expressed only within safe bounds. Strength, in this context, was not merely physical. It described a way of living grounded in reliability. It supported survival through familiarity and repetition, offering resilience so long as the world continued to ask the same questions. The environment, steady in its demands, quietly locked these traits into place. Through this slow alignment, a lineage took shape that matched its world closely, not because it lacked alternatives, but because its world rewarded consistency above all else. In this steady exchange between land and life, strength became the currency of survival, and flexibility learned to wait. Numbers thinned quietly, not through sudden loss, but through gradual limits on how many lives a place could sustain. Cold landscapes offered abundance unevenly, and the space between successful seasons stretched long. Groups remained close to known resources, and over time, their size reflected what those environments could reliably support. Populations became compact, intimate, and increasingly finite. Small populations carried a different kind of vulnerability. Where many individuals exist, variation spreads widely, buffering against misfortune. In fewer numbers, that cushion softens. Traits become concentrated, not by design, but because fewer options remain in circulation. Diversity narrows gently, generation by generation, as certain lineages persist while others fade without ceremony. This reduction did not remove strength or skill. It altered probability. In small groups, chance weighs heavier. A harsh winter, an accident, or a run of poor seasons affects a greater share of the population. Losses are felt immediately, and recovery takes longer. What might be absorbed easily by larger groups leaves a lasting mark when numbers are few. Genetic diversity reflects this same arithmetic. With fewer individuals contributing to the next generation, the range of inherited traits contracts. Some variations disappear simply because the people carrying them do not remain. Others become common through repetition rather than advantage. Over long spans of time, this process shapes a population that reflects its recent past more than its distant origins. Behavior and social structure adapt in response. Close-knit groups deepen cooperation, relying heavily on shared effort and familiarity. This strengthens internal bonds, but it also limits exchange. New individuals arrive less often. New traits enter slowly. The population becomes self-referencing, shaped largely by what it already holds. Resilience shifts under these conditions. Short-term survival can remain strong. Small groups coordinate well and share resources efficiently. Yet long-term stability becomes more fragile. When challenges arise that fall outside familiar experience, options feel fewer. Recovery depends on circumstances aligning favorably, rather than on broad capacity. Chance events gain influence as numbers shrink. Random loss can reshape an entire group. Successful years matter disproportionately, as do lean ones. The balance tips easily, and small fluctuations leave deep impressions. Survival continues, but with less margin for uncertainty. This gradual narrowing does not announce itself. Life goes on much as before, routines maintained, skills passed carefully from one generation to the next. Yet beneath the surface, the future grows more constrained. Fewer paths remain open, not because they are impossible, but because the population no longer carries the breadth required to explore them. In this quiet contraction, resilience declines without collapse. Strength and adaptation persist, effective within familiar bounds. At the same time, dependence on favorable conditions deepens. Population size, unseen and often overlooked, begins to shape destiny through probability alone, gently limiting what the future can hold. Cold did not arrive once and passed. It returned, withdrew, and returned again, each time pressing the same demands into the landscape. Ice advanced, retreated, then advanced once more, not allowing long intervals of calm between episodes. The land carried memory, and so did the bodies moving across it. What survived one cold period was asked to survive the next. These repetitions mattered more than any single event. Adaptations that proved effective were not given time to soften or reverse. Instead, they were reinforced. Each cold phase favored the same compact forms, the same endurance, the same strategies for conserving heat and energy. When warmth briefly returned, it rarely lasted long enough to reward a different direction. Evolution did not reset to a wider range of possibilities. It strengthened what was already in place. Between cold periods, recovery was limited. Populations did not rebound to large numbers, nor did they regain lost diversity. Resources fluctuated, but stability remained scarce. Stress events followed one another closely, allowing little opportunity for expansion or experimentation. Traits that carried survival through the previous cycle remained dominant simply because there was no space to try alternatives. Over time, this created momentum. Adaptations accumulated layer upon layer, each cold phase deepening commitment to the same solutions. Bodies became increasingly tuned to a narrow set of conditions. Behaviors followed the same path, repeating what had worked before with growing precision. The lineage did not pause to reconsider. It continued forward under pressure. This momentum was not intentional. There was no awareness of direction, no recognition that options were narrowing. Evolution responded to immediate demands, selecting for continuity in a world that kept repeating itself. When stress returns quickly, consistency outperforms change. The environment rewarded readiness over versatility. Repeated ice ages also magnified the cost of deviation. Individuals or groups that drifted from proven strategies faced higher risk when cold returned suddenly. There was little buffer for error. As a result, variability diminished. The population became more uniform in form and behavior, not because uniformity was ideal, but because it endured. Importantly, this reinforcement was cumulative rather than corrective. Evolution rarely backtracked. Traits reinforced by previous success were not easily undone, especially when new conditions echoed old ones. Each cycle made reversal less likely, turning adaptation into commitment. What began as a flexible response hardened into a defining characteristic. The absence of long recovery periods meant that stress shaped the baseline. There was no extended phase of abundance to reintroduce breadth or restore balance. Life continued, effective within its limits, yet increasingly shaped by repetition rather than opportunity. In this way, Repeated ice ages acted like a steady current rather than a sudden force. They nudged evolution along the same path again and again, building speed through familiarity. The lineage did not choose specialization. It was carried there, guided by momentum created through relentless recurrence, shaping a form of humanity bound closely to the cold world it had learned repeatedly how to survive. What begins as adjustment can slowly settle into habit. Over many generations, responses to pressure stop feeling temporary and start to define what is normal. Bodies, behaviors, and expectations align so closely with their environment that change grows difficult, not because it is impossible, but because everything is now tuned to work together as it is. Adaptations become embedded through interdependence. Physical traits support specific behaviors, and those behaviors reinforce the traits that enable them. A dense body favors certain movements. Those movements favor familiar routines. Routines depend on known resources, and known resources encourage staying close. Each part supports the next, forming a system that functions smoothly so long as conditions remain similar. When every element is linked, altering one piece disrupts the rest. This is how specialization quietly limits flexibility. Options that once existed fade from use, and unused possibilities grow distant. Skills not practiced soften. Routes not taken disappear from memory. Diets narrow as familiarity deepens. None of this feels like a loss in the moment. Life continues to work, survival continues to succeed. The narrowing goes unnoticed because it causes no immediate harm. Success reinforces itself. When a strategy delivers consistent survival, there is little incentive to abandon it. Proven solutions feel safe, and safety carries weight in uncertain environments. Over time, success becomes an expectation. The lineage is shaped by what has worked before, and that history guides future outcomes more strongly than unseen alternatives. This dynamic creates a quiet trap. Adaptation, once a tool for surviving change, becomes a commitment to a particular way of being. Flexibility yields to optimization. The population grows exceptionally good at navigating one set of conditions while losing breadth in the process. The more refined the adaptation, the harder it becomes to move away from it without cost. Evolutionary momentum builds in this space. Each generation inherits not just physical traits, but a framework shaped by countless past successes. Choices are constrained by what the body can support and what the environment has consistently rewarded. Momentum does not require direction. It emerges from accumulation. Once moving, it carries the lineage forward along the same path, making deviation less likely with every step. This is not the result of foresight or error. No future is anticipated, and no past is evaluated. Evolution responds only to the present moment, selecting for what endures now. When the present repeats itself often enough, endurance solidifies into identity. The lineage remains well adapted, resilient within familiar bounds. At the same time, it grows increasingly dependent on the continuation of those bounds. Adaptation has done its work too well. What once offered freedom now anchors life to a narrower range of outcomes. In this steady progression, change does not cease. It simply follows a channel worn deep by repetition. Adaptation becomes commitment, and commitment gathers speed. The lineage moves forward, effective and stable, carried by momentum built through long success in a world that asks the same things again and again. Life under persistent pressure reshapes not only bodies and strategies, but relationships. In demanding environments, survival depends less on individual effort and more on coordinated action. Social structure shifts gradually, shaped by the steady need to share work, risk, and resources in ways that reduce uncertainty for everyone involved. Groups become close knit out of necessity. Cooperation is not a moral ideal or a cultural flourish, but a practical response to conditions that reward mutual reliance. Tasks such as hunting large animals, maintaining shelters, processing food, and caring for the vulnerable require timing and trust. Individuals learn to read one another closely, anticipating needs and limits through familiarity built over time. These bonds form through repetition rather than choice. In small populations, social networks remain tight. Most individuals know one another directly, often across a lifetime. Relationships carry long memories, shaped by shared success and shared loss. Conflict still exists, but its cost is high when alternatives are few. Maintaining cohesion becomes a survival strategy in itself, quietly guiding behavior toward cooperation and restraint. This intimacy brings strength, but it also narrows exchange. With fewer connections beyond the group, ideas, techniques, and habits circulate within a limited sphere. Knowledge deepens locally, refined by experience in a particular place. At the same time, exposure to different approaches slows. Innovation arises from within the group's existing framework, rather than from frequent contact with outsiders. Harsh environments reinforce this pattern. Travel is costly, and unfamiliar social ties carry risk. Welcoming strangers requires resources and trust that may already be stretched thin. Over time, social boundaries become more defined, not through exclusion by design, but through practicality. Groups turn inward because inward is safer. These dynamics shape behavior without elevating or diminishing the people involved. Cooperation here is not inherently noble, nor is constraint a flaw. It reflects alignment with circumstance. Close social bonds support endurance, while limited exchange mirrors the same narrowing seen in bodies, diets, and strategies. Social life adapts alongside everything else. Importantly, this structure does not eliminate complexity. Emotional depth, communication, and shared understanding remain rich. Stories, skills, and care pass carefully between generations. What changes is scale. The social world becomes smaller, denser, and more intensely interconnected. Every action carries weight because it affects people known well, often for life. Over time, these pressures reinforce expectations. Roles settle into familiar patterns guided by what has worked reliably. Cooperation becomes habitual, less a conscious effort than an assumed part of daily life. At the same time, opportunities for external influence decline. The group remains resilient within its bounds, but increasingly shaped by its own continuity. Social structure, like physical form, reflects adaptation without intention. It grows out of repeated demands placed on a limited number of people sharing a demanding world. Neither romantic nor diminished, this way of living is simply fitted to its context. In the quiet closeness of these groups, survival is carried forward through shared effort, mutual dependence, and the steady narrowing that pressure brings. Over time, the land ceased to be something passed through and became something known. Paths repeated until they were worn into memory. Hills, river bends, and sheltered valleys carried meaning not as landmarks on a journey, but as anchors of daily life. Territory was no longer an abstract space. It was an extension of experience, shaped by years of careful attention. This stability grew from necessity. In demanding climates, wandering widely carried risk that could not always be repaid. Each unfamiliar stretch of ground required testing, and testing consumed energy. Mistakes cost time, warmth, and sometimes life itself. Remaining within a limited region reduced uncertainty. Familiar places offered predictable resources, known dangers, and reliable shelter. The land rewarded those who knew it deeply. With this familiarity came an intricate understanding of the place. Seasonal movements of animals, subtle changes in vegetation, and the timing of weather shifts were learned through repetition. Knowledge became precise rather than broad. Small details mattered, and they were remembered because they returned each year. The landscape was read like a well worn text, its patterns reinforcing confidence through recognition. The movement did not disappear, but it changed in character. Travel became purposeful, confined to routes already tested. Long migrations, once a response to shifting conditions, grew costly when bodies required steady energy and groups remained small. Carrying the weight of daily survival across uncertain terrain demanded more than it promised in return. Staying close offered balance. Each step taken within known ground reduces risk. This rootedness shaped behavior quietly. Territories became shared references across generations, passed down through practice rather than instruction. Children learned where to walk, where to wait, and where caution mattered most. The land taught through familiarity. Over time, attachment to place deepened, not through ownership or exclusion, but through reliance. Such a relationship did not reflect stagnation, it reflected alignment. Rooted living supported survival by reducing variables in a world already heavy with pressure. Stability allowed focus, refinement, and efficiency. When conditions offered little tolerance for experimentation, grounding life in known terrain provided resilience. The land became a partner rather than a challenge, understood through patience rather than conquest. Territorial stability also reinforced social continuity. Shared landscapes supported shared memory. Stories, skills, and responsibilities gathered around the same places year after year. This continuity reduced conflict and supported cooperation, anchoring social life as firmly as physical survival. The environment shaped not only movement, but belonging. Over long spans of time, this way of living left its mark. Bodies, behaviors, and expectations aligned with the scale of familiar territories. Expansion outward felt unnecessary when survival depended on depth rather than range. The world narrowed, not because curiosity ended, but because the cost of distance outweighed its promise. In this steady relationship with the land, humanity adapted without fanfare. Rootedness emerged as a solution, shaped by constraint and reinforced by success. What might appear limited from a distance functioned as survival in practice, a quiet balance between people and place, carried forward through careful knowing rather than constant movement. Stability settles slowly, almost invisibly. It arrives through repeated success, through days that end as expected, through seasons navigated without surprise. When strategies deliver food, warmth, and continuity, they begin to feel trustworthy. Survival becomes familiar, and familiarity carries comfort. What works, works again, and that repetition builds confidence without announcement. Reliable strategies feel like confirmation. Each successful outcome reinforces the sense that the chosen path is sound. Hunting patterns that return the same results, territories that provide known resources, and social rhythms that reduce conflict all contribute to this perception. Life unfolds within boundaries that feel secure because they have held before. Stability becomes interpreted as strength. Under these conditions, change acquires weight. Altering routines introduces uncertainty into a system that already functions. Exploration promises possibility, but it also threatens disruption. In environments where margins remain narrow, even small miscalculations can ripple outward. A failed experiment costs time, energy, and opportunity. When the present feels dependable, the future feels risky. Adaptation begins to discourage exploration not through fear, but through comparison. Familiar strategies consistently outperform unknown ones, at least in the short term. The safer choice is reinforced again and again. Over time, curiosity yields to caution. Paths not taken fade from consideration, not because they are forbidden, but because they appear unnecessary. This process is subtle. No decision marks a turning point. Individuals continue to learn, adjust, and respond within established patterns. Yet the scope of adjustment narrows. Innovation focuses on refinement rather than departure, on improving existing practices instead of seeking alternatives. Adaptation settles inward. The sense of safety this brings is real. Stable systems reduce stress and support endurance. They allow skills to deepen and coordination to sharpen. Communities thrive within known limits, drawing resilience from predictability. Life feels manageable when the world responds as expected. At the same time, this comfort conceals vulnerability. Dependence grows quietly. When success relies on a narrow set of conditions, deviation becomes costly. The more finely tuned the system, the less tolerant it becomes to disruption. Stability protects, but it also binds. This vulnerability is not dramatic. It does not announce itself through immediate weakness. It exists as potential, carried forward alongside success. As long as conditions remain similar, the system holds. When they shift beyond familiar bounds, options feel fewer. The skills that once ensured survival may no longer align perfectly with new demands. Importantly, this is not complacency. It is a reasonable response to repeated experience. When a strategy has proven itself across generations, trusting it makes sense. The danger lies not in reliance, but in the narrowing that accompanies it. Safety derived from consistency can mask how tightly survival has become coupled to a particular way of living. In this quiet space, adaptation completes a turn. What began as flexibility in response to change becomes preference for what is known. Stability feels like safety, and safety encourages staying close to what has worked before. Beneath the calm of reliable success, a delicate dependence forms, carrying life forward confidently, yet increasingly exposed to the unknown beyond its well-worn paths. Elsewhere on the same planet, under different rhythms of wind, rain, and season, a human presence moved with lighter attachment. This lineage did not carry the same depth of commitment to a single place. Its way of living remained responsive, shaped by movement rather than consolidation, by adjustment rather than reinforcement. The land was still familiar, but not binding. Mobility defined this strategy. Groups shifted ranges as conditions changed, following resources across wider spaces. Bodies supported endurance without demanding constant excess fuel, allowing longer travel with fewer costs. Diets remained broad, drawing from varied sources rather than relying on a narrow set of dependable returns. This flexibility was not restless or unfocused. It was measured, practiced, and grounded in experience. Adaptability extended beyond movement. Tools and techniques changed more readily, adjusted to new environments without long periods of refinement. Strategies did not need to be perfected for one place. because they were designed to work across many. Familiarity existed, but it was not exclusive. Knowledge traveled easily, carried from one region to another, reshaped by local conditions rather than fixed by them. Social networks reflected this openness. Groups connected more frequently across distances, sharing genes, behaviors, and skills. Population size fluctuated, but exchange remained active. This circulation preserved diversity and softened the effects of chance. When circumstances shifted, variation offered options. Survival rested on the ability to change course rather than to endure repetition. This approach did not replace the specialized strategy already in place elsewhere. It coexisted. Different ways of being human unfolded in parallel, each aligned with its environment. There was no clear superiority in this moment, only contrast. Where conditions demanded consistency, specialization worked. Where variability persisted, adaptability proved useful. Importantly, this difference was not a response to competition. It emerged from geography, climate, and timing. Each lineage reflected the pressures it faced most often. Neither was more human than the other. Both carried intelligence, cooperation, and care. They simply organized life around different assumptions about what the future would require. Movement offered insurance against change. When familiar patterns failed, relocation provided alternatives. This did not remove risk, but it distributed it. No single place carried the full weight of survival. The strategy relied on connection and responsiveness, allowing adjustment before pressure accumulated too deeply. At the same time, this flexibility carried its own costs. Travel demanded energy, uncertainty, and constant learning. Stability remained provisional. Yet within fluctuating landscapes, provisional arrangements could persist longer than fixed ones. Adaptability became a form of balance rather than excess. As these two human strategies shared the world, they represented divergent responses to the same underlying challenge. One refined itself to match a repeated environment. The other stayed loose, prepared for variation. Neither path was chosen. Both emerged gradually, shaped by circumstance. In this quiet divergence, humanity expanded its range of possibilities. Different solutions unfolded side by side, not in conflict, but as reflections of the many ways a single species could endure a changing Earth. For a long stretch of time, these different human strategies occupied the same world. Valleys, plains, and shifting margins of forest and ice did not belong to one lineage alone. They were shared, crossed, revisited, and remembered by multiple kinds of people moving through the same spaces at different rhythms. Coexistence unfolded quietly, measured in generations rather than events. This overlap did not resemble a meeting of opposites. It appeared as parallel lives unfolding side by side. Groups passed through familiar regions in different seasons, returned to favored shelters, and hunted similar animals when conditions allowed. The land offered enough variation to support more than one way of surviving, at least for a time. Presence did not require dominance, it required timing and patience. Thousands of years passed under these conditions. Climate continued to shift, though not always in the same pattern. Resources expanded and contracted. Populations moved, settled, withdrew, and returned. Throughout this long interval, no single moment marked a decisive turning point. Life continued with a sense of continuity, even as pressures accumulated beneath the surface. The sharing of landscapes did not imply constant contact. Encounters were likely infrequent, shaped by distance, season, and movement. Yet the world itself remained a common stage. Rivers still cut through familiar ground, Migration routes of animals remained broadly predictable. Shelter sites carried long histories, used and reused across deep time. Human presence layered gently over itself. Importantly, the eventual disappearance of one lineage was not immediate or dramatic. There was no sudden collapse etched into the land. Instead, numbers declined slowly. Groups grew smaller. Gaps widened between generations. Presence thinned rather than shattered. Extinction arrived quietly, stretched across thousands of years without a single defining moment. This gradual fading reflects how tightly survival had become tied to specific conditions. As environments changed in ways that favored adaptability over endurance, margins narrowed. Strategies that once worked well began to strain. Recovery from losses took longer. Each absence mattered more. Yet life persisted, sustained as long as circumstances allowed. During this time, shared landscapes continued to bear witness. Hills and coastlines remained, indifferent to the number of people crossing them. The land did not mark disappearance with ceremony. It simply absorbed it, leaving space where activity once lingered. What remained was continuity, not rupture. The pace of this transition matters. It reminds us that extinction is not always an event. It can be a process, shaped by probabilities rather than catastrophe. Coexistence did not end because of a single cause. It ended because conditions slowly tipped beyond what one strategy could reliably meet. In this long overlap, humanity existed in more than one form, sharing time as well as space. The ending of that shared chapter did not arrive with violence or finality. It arrived through quiet imbalance, carried forward year by year. The land endured, unchanged in its broad shape, while one presence gradually slipped from its familiar paths. Long after paths diverged, connection remained possible. When different human groups met, the boundary between them was not fixed or impermeable. Bodies that had adapted along separate lines still recognized one another at a fundamental level. Genetic material moved quietly between populations, carried through ordinary acts of human life rather than rare or extraordinary events. This mixing did not require harmony or conflict to define it. It occurred because proximity allowed it. Shared landscapes brought encounters, and encounters brought exchange. Over generations, these small crossings left lasting traces, woven into the fabric of later populations. Genes moved not as symbols of unity, but as evidence that separation had never been complete. The presence of this genetic blending speaks to deep compatibility. Despite differences in build, habit, and adaptation, these humans remained part of the same biological continuum. Their bodies could join, and their offspring could thrive. This alone places limits on how separate their paths truly were. Divergence had shaped form and strategy, but it had not broken the underlying connection. Boundaries between groups existed, but they were porous. Geography, climate, and behavior influenced how often people met, not whether they could. Distance reduced exchange, and familiarity encouraged it, but neither erased shared ancestry. Even after long periods apart, compatibility persisted, carrying echoes of a common past forward into the future. This genetic continuity reframes how difference is understood. Neanderthals were not a separate kind of being, isolated from the human story. They were a regional expression of humanity, shaped by particular pressures, carrying distinct traits without losing their place within the broader lineage. The differences that marked them were real and meaningful, yet they unfolded within a shared framework. Interbreeding did not erase distinction, nor did it merge populations into uniformity. Instead, It layered histories together. Traits moved selectively, influenced by chance, proximity, and survival. Some genetic contributions persisted, others faded, leaving uneven patterns that reflect the complexity of human movement and interaction rather than a single narrative arc. This exchange also underscores the gradual nature of divergence. Evolutionary paths separated slowly, and they rejoined occasionally without contradiction. The process was not clean or categorical. It allowed overlap, mixture, and return. Humanity remained fluid, even as specialization deepened in different regions. Importantly, this compatibility challenges the idea of absolute separation. The human story was not divided into discrete chapters with closed endings. It unfolded through continuity, with lines that crossed and blurred over time. Neanderthals existed within that continuity, not outside it. Their genetic legacy remains as quiet evidence of shared humanity. It does not suggest victory or loss. It simply records contact, relationship, and persistence. Through this blending, the past continues to live in subtle ways, reminding us that difference within humanity has always existed alongside connection, shaped by circumstance rather than separation into entirely different worlds. The rhythm of the world began to quicken. Climate shifts that once unfolded over long, familiar intervals started to arrive closer together, layering change upon change. Temperature swings sharpened, vegetation zones shifted faster, coastlines altered, and migration patterns of animals became less predictable. The environment no longer lingered long enough in one state to be mastered before becoming something else. For specialists, this acceleration carried weight. Adaptations built through patience and repetition relied on consistency. Bodies, behaviors, and strategies tuned to stable patterns found fewer opportunities to perform at their best. When cold arrived earlier, retreated sooner, or returned differently, familiar solutions lost precision. What had been reliable under slow change became strained when change compressed time. Recovery mattered more now, and it was harder to achieve. Between environmental shifts, there was little opportunity to rebuild numbers, restore diversity, or recalibrate routines. Stress accumulated rather than clearing. Each disruption arrived before the last had fully settled, eroding margins that had once provided balance. The system remained functional, but increasingly tight. Flexibility gained quiet value under these conditions. Strategies that could adjust quickly, even imperfectly, navigated change with fewer consequences. Mobility allowed relocation before resources failed. Broader diets absorbed fluctuations more smoothly. Social networks that extended across regions shared information and variation that softened local loss. These traits did not dominate, they endured. This contrast was shaped by timing rather than merit. Specialists had thrived when the world changed slowly and predictably. Now the pace had shifted. The environment asked different questions, and it asked them faster. Success was no longer defined by how well a strategy matched a specific condition, but by how well it could absorb uncertainty. Importantly, this shift does not imply inferiority. Specialized adaptations remained effective within narrow bounds. They did not fail suddenly or completely. They continued to support life where conditions aligned closely enough. The strain came from mismatch, from change arriving faster than recalibration allowed. The environment set this tempo without intention. Ice retreated unevenly, warm phases shortened, droughts and cold snaps overlapped unpredictably. No lineage caused these changes, and no lineage controlled their arrival. Survival reflected alignment with circumstance rather than capability in isolation. As variability increased, resilience depended on responsiveness. Strategies that allowed retreat, adjustment, and redistribution preserved options. Even when outcomes were uncertain, the ability to shift course reduced cumulative loss. In contrast, strategies dependent on precise conditions faced compounding pressure when those conditions fragmented. This period did not transform the landscape overnight. It unfolded gradually, but with a noticeable difference in pace. Change itself became the constant. Environments no longer waited to be learned fully before moving on. Within this accelerating world, survival favored timing, not foresight, not superiority, but readiness. Those able to respond quickly retained balance longer. Those bound tightly to familiar patterns felt the ground move beneath them more often. The environment did not choose winners. It simply changed faster, and in doing so, reshaped which strategies could keep pace. Loss does not need to be dramatic to matter. As conditions shifted and variability increased, survival began to rest on ever thinner margins. What once felt manageable now required more effort, more precision, and more favorable timing. Small disadvantages, barely noticeable on their own, began to accumulate through repetition. When margins are wide, variation is absorbed. Missed opportunities can be balanced by later success. In narrower conditions, balance becomes delicate. A slightly shorter season, a modest decline in available prey, or a brief interruption in cooperation can ripple forward. Each shortfall carries weight into the next cycle, leaving less room to recover fully. These disadvantages did not arrive together. They appeared one at a time, layered across years. Reduced population size magnified their effects. Lower diversity limited alternative responses. Familiar strategies still functioned, but required closer alignment to circumstance. Precision replaced tolerance. Survival depended increasingly on things going mostly right. Energy budgets tightened further. Bodies adapted for endurance now required steady intake in environments that offered less predictability. A missed hunt no longer meant inconvenience. It meant strain, carried into future days. Over time, repeated strain reduced resilience, even when conditions briefly improved. Recovery became partial rather than complete. Social systems felt this pressure as well. Close-knit cooperation remained essential, but loss within small groups affected everyone. The absence of even one experienced individual could shift responsibilities unevenly. Knowledge was deep, but less redundant. Skills carried by few people became points of vulnerability rather than strength. Continuity depended on the alignment of many small factors. Importantly, survival did not collapse at this stage. Life continued, but with diminished margin for error. Strategies that once tolerated variation now operated near their limits. The difference between persistence and decline rested on subtle alignment rather than dramatic change. Fragility emerged quietly, unnoticed until pressure accumulated. This fragility was structural, not emotional. It arose from probability rather than panic. Systems finely tuned to specific conditions perform exceptionally when those conditions persist. When they shift, even slightly, performance declines incrementally. Over time, incremental decline reshapes outcomes. Chance events gained influence again. Random loss mattered more when systems were already strained. Where resources had once supported recovery, they now merely sustained continuity. Each unfavorable occurrence narrowed options further. Each favorable one delayed, but did not fully restore. earlier balance. None of this implies weakness or failure. It reflects the limits of specialization under changing circumstances. Adaptation had carried life forward for a long time. As margins shrank, its effectiveness depended increasingly on alignment with conditions that were no longer stable. Survival became a careful negotiation rather than a robust buffer. Life persisted, but lightly held. Small disadvantages compounded slowly, shaping a future that remained possible, yet increasingly constrained. In this narrowing space, fragility took form not as collapse, but as sustained tension, where endurance depended on threads drawn ever tighter by the quiet mathematics of survival. Decline did not announce itself with a single turning point. It unfolded gradually, stretched across long spans of time in which life continued much as it had before. Camps were still used. Routes were still followed. Knowledge was still passed from one generation to the next. The pattern changed, not through rupture, but through thinning. Population numbers eased downward slowly. Groups grew smaller, then smaller again, often without noticing the difference from one generation to the next. Births became less frequent. Losses lingered longer. Recovery followed, but not fully. Each cycle left the population slightly reduced, though still functioning, still coherent, still present. There was no singular disaster driving this shift. No wave of destruction swept across the land. Climate continued to fluctuate, sometimes favorably, sometimes not, but without one defining blow. Resources did not vanish overnight. Instead, margins narrowed incrementally, making growth harder to sustain. What had once supported expansion now supported continuity alone. This kind of decline resists drama. It is composed of ordinary days accumulating quietly. A successful season followed by a less successful one. A generation that holds steady, then one that falls slightly short. The difference is subtle, visible only when viewed across centuries rather than years. Life persists, but it leaves fewer traces behind. As populations shrank, absence appeared before extinction. Regions once used regularly fell quiet. Familiar shelters went seasons without return. The land absorbed these gaps easily, erasing signs of use with wind, frost, and growth. From a distance, the world looked unchanged, even as human presence receded. Social continuity softened the experience. Small groups retained cohesion and familiarity. Rituals, skills, and shared memory continued, reinforcing a sense of normalcy. From within, life did not feel like a collapse. It felt like persistence under constraint. Decline existed as a background process, rather than a defining event. Over time, however, the arithmetic of numbers took hold. Fewer individuals meant fewer connections, fewer overlaps, fewer chances for recovery. Losses that might once have been absorbed now left lasting impressions. Each generation carried slightly less possibility forward than the one before. This disappearance was quiet because it followed the logic of probability rather than force. When conditions consistently favor reduction over growth, decline becomes the default outcome. Nothing needs to fail outright. Things only need to continue operating within limits that no longer allow expansion. Eventually, presence becomes too sparse to sustain itself. But even this is not a moment. It is a final thinning, a gradual easing out of existence rather than an ending that can be pointed to. The land remains unchanged in its broad contours. What fades is the pattern of return. In this way, decline unfolds without collapse. It leaves no sharp boundary between presence and absence. It settles gently into history, carried by time rather than crisis. What remains is continuity of the world itself, bearing witness to a form of humanity that lived, endured, and then quietly slipped from its familiar paths. Long after physical presence faded, traces remained, carried quietly forward in living bodies, not as memories or monuments, but as sequences of inherited material passed from parent to child across countless generations. These genetic traces do not announce themselves. They persist silently, embedded within the broader human story. In modern populations, small portions of DNA reflect this ancient sharing. They appear unevenly, scattered rather than uniform, shaped by movement, contact, and chance. Some regions carry more, others less, reflecting the paths people took and the encounters they experienced. These fragments are not complete records. They are echoes, partial and fragmented, yet undeniably real. What they represent is continuity rather than survival in the usual sense. Neanderthals did not endure as a distinct population, but elements of their biology continued within others. This inheritance does not elevate one lineage over another. It simply acknowledges that disappearance and persistence are not always opposites. Life does not require permanence to leave an imprint. These genetic contributions did not persist because they were superior. They remained because they were compatible. Some variations carried no cost. Others fit quietly into new contexts. Over time, they became part of a shared genetic background, indistinguishable from countless other contributions drawn from deep human history. Their presence reflects connection, not conquest. The persistence of these traces reframes extinction itself. Loss did occur. A way of living ended, shaped by specific conditions that no longer held. Yet the ending was not absolute. Biological continuity carried forward in altered form, woven into a broader tapestry. What vanished was a particular expression of humanity, not humanity itself. This legacy is subtle. It does not define identity or destiny. It does not tell a story of victory or replacement. It simply records contact and inheritance, shaped by proximity and time. The genetic record preserves relationship rather than outcome. Modern humans do not carry these traces consciously. They are part of the background of life, influencing nothing directly and everything indirectly. Their presence serves as evidence that the past is not cleanly separated from the present. Human history overlaps itself, layers forming where stories intersected rather than replaced one another. In this way, survival extends beyond extinction. It exists not as dominance, but as persistence within change. The genetic legacy does not seek recognition. It requires no interpretation. It simply remains, quietly demonstrating that separation was never complete and that endings in evolution are often transformations rather than erasures. The story written in DNA carries no judgment. It offers no lesson, no moral, no resolution. It confirms only that humanity has always been plural, connected through shared origins and shared futures. In the subtle inheritance of ancient genes, the past continues to accompany the present, not as a shadow, but as part of the living continuity of our species. Failure is a word borrowed from intention, and evolution does not operate with intent. It does not plan, aim, or revise. It responds, moment by moment, to the conditions that exist. When a lineage ends, it is tempting to read that ending backward, to search for mistakes or shortcomings. Yet extinction reflects circumstance, not judgment. Across Earth's history, most forms of life have disappeared, not because they were weak, but because the world that shaped them changed in ways that no longer favored their particular balance. Success in one context does not guarantee persistence in another. What matters is timing. the alignment between traits and environment at a specific moment. When that alignment dissolves, continuation becomes unlikely, regardless of past endurance. Evolution selects without preference. It does not reward effort or punish specialization. It simply filters what remains when conditions shift. A lineage may thrive for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, finely tuned to its surroundings. If the environment transforms faster than those traits can recalibrate, disappearance follows. This outcome says nothing about the quality of what existed before. Context defines survival. A trait that offers stability during repeated cold periods may become restrictive during rapid warming. A strategy that excels in familiar terrain may struggle when landscapes fragment. These shifts do not reflect failure. They reflect change in the questions the environment asks. Evolution offers no guarantee that yesterday's answers will remain useful. Timing deepens this understanding. Extinction often arrives not because adaptation ceases, but because change accelerates beyond the pace of adjustment. When environments remain stable or cyclic, specialization can persist indefinitely. When variability increases, flexibility gains advantage. Neither outcome is superior. Each is a response to when and where a lineage exists. The environment acts as the deciding factor, though without intention, it does not target specific lineages. It simply changes. Those already aligned continue. Those less aligned fade. This process is impartial, governed by physics, climate, geography, and chance. Evolution does not favor complexity over simplicity, strength over delicacy, or intelligence over endurance. It favors compatibility with current conditions, nothing more. Understanding this neutrality reframes disappearance. A lineage ending does not negate its history or significance. It reflects that the world moved on in a direction that no longer sustained that form. Many successful organisms have vanished after long periods of stability. Their absence now does not erase their effectiveness then. Rethinking failure allows space for humility. Humanity exists because of alignment, not inevitability. Our persistence reflects circumstance as much as capacity. The same processes that shaped other lineages continue to shape us, indifferent to identity or expectation. Evolution carries no verdict. It records outcomes without commentary. In this quiet ledger, extinction stands not as defeat, but as transition, a natural consequence of change in a world that never stops rearranging the conditions of life. Nothing in this story was designed to arrive where it did. Evolution does not aim toward outcomes, and it does not steer away from them either. It moves without a map, responding only to what is present in each moment. The paths that emerge do so because conditions allow them, not because they are selected in advance. Change begins locally and proceeds unevenly. Small variations appear without purpose, shaped by inheritance and chance. Most do nothing of consequence. A few alter survival slightly, depending on where and when they arise. Over time, these minor differences accumulate, guided not by intention but by circumstance. What persists is simply what happens to fit the moment long enough to be carried forward. Chance plays a quiet but constant role. Who survives a harsh season? Who finds a mate? Which groups encounter one another, and which do not, are all shaped partly by randomness. Even under strong environmental pressure, outcomes remain probabilistic rather than certain. Evolution works with these probabilities, not against them, allowing histories to form that could easily have unfolded differently. This is where the idea of an accident belongs, not as error and not as failure, but as an acknowledgement that outcomes are contingent. A lineage adapts to repeated conditions and becomes increasingly aligned with them. If those conditions change slowly, adaptation keeps pace. If they shift quickly, alignment falters. This divergence is not a misstep. It is the result of timing intersecting with circumstance. There is no blame assigned within this process. Evolution does not evaluate. It does not correct course. It does not preserve options for later use. It works entirely within the present. What appears, survives, and reproduces continues. What does not, fades. This neutrality is essential to understanding why outcomes feel both precise and unplanned at once. The same pressures that created specialization also sustained it for a long time. The same adaptations that later constrained flexibility once provided stability. These outcomes were not chosen with foresight, and they were not mistakes recognized too late. They were reasonable responses to the conditions that existed when they arose. Looking backward, it is tempting to trace a straight line from origin to ending. In reality, the path was made of countless small turns, each shaped by immediate context. Many alternatives could have unfolded. Slight shifts in climate, movement, or connection would have produced different results. None of these possibilities were favored or excluded ahead of time. Understanding this removes judgment from the story. Evolution does not reward restraint or punish commitment. It does not favor generalists over specialists or flexibility over endurance. It only reflects the alignment between life and environment at a given moment. When that alignment holds, continuation follows. When it does not, change occurs. This perspective restores proportion. What happened was not inevitable, and it was not avoidable. It was contingent. It arose from chance layered upon constraint, unfolding without intention. The outcome feels meaningful because it shaped the present, not because it was aimed toward it. In this light, the story becomes quieter and more honest. The path that formed was one of many that could have been taken, shaped by circumstance rather than design, emerging without blame, without plan, and without promise of permanence. Risk did not appear suddenly, and it was not obvious while life continued to function. It grew slowly within success itself, carried forward by strategies that worked well enough to persist. Specialization offered reliability, and reliability offered survival. Yet over long spans of time, the same qualities that sustained life also shaped its exposure. When adaptation narrows around a stable pattern, it trades breadth for precision. This exchange feels sensible in the moment. Efficiency increases, effort becomes focused, resources are used with care. The system performs smoothly under familiar conditions. What fades quietly is tolerance for deviation. The range of circumstances that can be met without strain gradually contracts. This is where long-term vulnerability takes hold. It does not weaken daily survival. It alters response to change. When conditions fall within expected bounds, specialized strategies excel. When conditions drift beyond them, adjustment becomes difficult. The system does not break, but it struggles to reorganize quickly. Recovery requires time that may no longer be available. Stability plays a subtle role in concealing this danger. Repeated success reassures. It reinforces trust in established solutions and discourages reconsideration. As long as outcomes remain acceptable, there is no signal to broaden approach or restore lost flexibility. Stability becomes evidence of strength, even as it tightens dependency on specific conditions. Over generations, this dependency compounds. Bodies align with particular demands. Diets settle around dependable sources. Social structures organize around known routines. Territory becomes familiar and deeply understood. Each layer adds effectiveness, and each layer reduces room to maneuver. The system grows coherent and efficient, yet increasingly committed to a narrow set of assumptions. None of this reflects miscalculation. It reflects adaptation doing exactly what it is meant to do, optimizing survival under present conditions. Risk emerges not from poor response, but from the absence of foresight. Evolution does not preserve unused options in anticipation of future change. It refines what works now and lets the rest fade. When environments begin to shift faster or in new directions, the hidden cost becomes visible. Strategies that once reduced uncertainty now struggle to absorb it. Variation that could have supported adjustment is limited. Population size and diversity no longer provide a buffer. The system remains functional, but with thinner margins and greater sensitivity to disruption. This vulnerability is structural rather than dramatic. It does not announce itself through collapse. It accumulates quietly, revealed only when change outpaces recalibration. Stability, once protective, becomes misleading. It suggests resilience where fragility has been quietly growing. Understanding this risk reframes the story. It shows how endurance and exposure can coexist. A lineage can be deeply successful for a very long time and still become vulnerable to future change. There is no contradiction in this. It is a natural outcome of commitment under constraint. In calm retrospect, the risk lay not in specialization itself, but in its permanence. What made this path effective also made it delicate. Stability supported life, and at the same time, it masked the narrowing that left little room when the world began to ask unfamiliar things. The distance between lineages was once narrower than it appears from the present. Early in our shared history, variation remained modest, shaped by movement, connection, and overlap rather than division. Bodies differed, behaviors shifted, yet the underlying pattern was still fluid. What later became distinct was once part of a single, branching continuum. Shared origins mean shared possibilities. The traits that later defined different paths existed as gradients, not boundaries. Strength and endurance, flexibility and range, innovation and reliability all appeared in varying combinations across populations. No single direction carried priority. Circumstance determined which traits accumulated and which faded, guided by environment rather than intent. From this perspective, separation was not pre-written. It emerged gradually as conditions diverged. Populations exposed to repeated cold, isolation, and constraint narrowed toward one form of survival. Others, shaped by movement and variability, retained broader ranges of response. These were not opposing strategies at their origin. They were expressions of the same human capacity responding to different pressures. The question of proximity lingers quietly here, not as speculation, but as recognition of contingency. Small differences in climate patterns, movement routes, or connections could have altered outcomes. A slightly warmer interval, a longer period of stability, or more frequent mixing might have preserved alternative balances. Evidence shows these systems were sensitive to timing and scale, not locked into inevitable outcomes. Avoiding speculation means staying close to what remains visible. Fossils, tools, landscapes, and genetic traces all point toward continuity rather than separation. They reveal that divergence was gradual and partial. At no point did humanity split cleanly into incompatible forms. Overlap persisted for long spans of time, reinforcing shared capacity rather than difference. This understanding removes distance without collapsing distinction. Different paths existed, shaped by real constraints and real adaptations, yet none stood outside the range of human possibility. The qualities that later defined one lineage did not exclude the other. They were arranged differently, emphasized by circumstance, not defined by destiny. Letting this awareness settle reframes survival itself. Existence was not secured by essence or superiority. It depended on alignment between traits and environment at particular moments. The same processes that narrowed one path sustained another. Both arose from the same starting material, shaped by context rather than plan. In this light, continuity becomes more striking than loss. The traits that carried one lineage forward did not belong exclusively to it. They were drawn from a shared pool of variation present early on. What differs is not humanity itself, but the conditions that guided its expression. The idea lingers without resolution. Human history narrows and expands according to pressures it does not choose. The present reflects one outcome among many that once existed. Within that awareness, the past remains close, not as an alternate history, but as a reminder that survival has always been fragile, contingent, and shared. Human history appears broad only when viewed from close range. Stepping back reveals how narrow survival truly is. Many human lineages emerged, adapted, and persisted for long stretches of time. Most are now gone. What remains is a single thread carried forward through a landscape once dense with variation. Survival has never been the default. It has always been selective, shaped by conditions that favor some paths while quietly closing others. Over deep time, countless forms of life have risen and disappeared, and humanity follows the same pattern. The fact that one lineage continues does not mean it was destined to do so. It means it remained aligned with the world as it changed. Very few lineages endure indefinitely. Even those that thrive for hundreds of thousands of years do so under specific circumstances. When those circumstances shift, survival becomes uncertain. Persistence depends not on strength alone, nor intelligence alone, but on fit. That fit is temporary, held in balance between biology and environment. The fragility of success becomes clear when viewed across long timescales. Adaptations that secure survival in one era may narrow options in the next. Stability can extend life, yet it can also reduce tolerance for change. Success carries momentum, and momentum can limit flexibility. The path forward grows thinner, even as it feels secure. Human survival rests within this same pattern. Our continuation reflects alignment, not exemption. Small populations once expanded, while others contracted. Small advantages accumulated, while small disadvantages quietly compounded. Chance events, timing, and context shaped which lineages remained visible in the present. This perspective invites humility. Existence is not proof of superiority, it is evidence of circumstance. Our presence today reflects a series of alignments that did not need to occur, but did. Many equally capable human forms lived alongside us or before us. Their disappearance does not diminish their complexity or their endurance. When history is viewed as a narrow passage rather than a march forward, the tone shifts. Survival feels less triumphant and more delicate. The present stands on a slender foundation of past contingencies. Each generation extends the thread slightly further, held up by conditions that continue to change. Recognizing this does not weaken the human story. It grounds it. It situated humanity within the same natural processes that shape all life. Persistence becomes something provisional, renewed continuously rather than secured once and for all. In the quiet span of deep time, what stands out is not dominance, but rarity. To endure at all is uncommon. To endure long enough to leave traces is rarer still. Human history is narrow not because it lacks depth, but because survival itself is constrained. The living world does not promise continuation. It offers opportunity, shaped by circumstance. Humanity remains here because its path has stayed aligned so far. That alignment has always been fragile, and it continues to be so. The earliest stages of their history hold lessons that speak softly rather than instruct. These lessons are not warnings or prescriptions. They emerge naturally from observing how life adjusts within limits, shaping itself through balance rather than force. Adaptability appears here not as a trait to be claimed, but as a process that unfolds gradually, shaped by circumstance. Adaptation does not require dominance, it requires fit. In stable conditions, balance favors refinement, a narrowing toward what works reliably. In variable conditions, balance favors breadth, the capacity to shift without strain. Neither approach carries inherent priority. Each exists in relationship to the world that surrounds it. What matters is not which strategy prevails, but how closely it aligns with what the environment allows. In the origins of this lineage, adaptability operated within tight boundaries. Life adjusted to cold, isolation, and predictability by becoming efficient and focused. This was not an overreach. It was a measured response to repeated pressures. Balance was achieved by matching energy use, movement, and social structure to a demanding landscape. The system worked because its parts remained aligned with one another. Yet balance is dynamic. It depends on conditions remaining within a familiar range. When that range shifts, balance must be renegotiated. Adaptability then requires room to move, variation to draw upon, and time to recalibrate. Where those elements are limited, adjustment becomes slower and more fragile. This is not failure. It is the natural consequence of commitment within constraint. The quiet lesson lies in recognizing how easily balance can tip without drama. No single moment defines the transition. Small shifts accumulate. What once felt stable grows sensitive. The system continues to function, but with less margin. Adaptability remains present, yet it is constrained by the shape it has already taken. This understanding carries relevance without analogy. It does not point outward or forward. It simply clarifies how life operates when guided by context rather than ambition. Adaptability is not endless flexibility, nor is it rigid persistence. It is the ability to remain aligned as conditions change within the limits of what has already been shaped. Balance, in this sense, is not equilibrium between opposing forces. It is coherence within a particular moment. When the moment changes, coherence must change with it. If it cannot, life moves quietly toward another form or another ending. This process is neutral, unmarked by intent or judgment. In their origins, the emphasis was never on dominance, it was on endurance. Survival emerged through measured responses to repeated demands. The lesson rests not in what was gained or lost, but in how closely existence remained tied to its setting. These lessons do not instruct behavior or predict outcomes. They simply describe the conditions under which life persists. Adaptability exists not as a virtue, but as a relationship. Balance holds not because it is chosen, but because it fits. In this calm unfolding, their origins reveal how survival depends less on reaching outward than on staying aligned, moment by moment, with the world as it is. Their story continues to matter because it reveals where the edges of humanity lie, not the edges of intelligence or creativity, but the limits set by environment, scale, and time. It shows that being human has never meant being unconstrained. Survival has always depended on conditions that extend beyond intention or awareness. Understanding these limits does not diminish humanity, it clarifies it. The past shows that endurance requires alignment, and that alignment is temporary. Traits that sustain life under one set of circumstances do not carry guarantees into the next. This has always been true, even when survival lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. What their history makes visible is how narrow the margin can be between persistence and disappearance. The difference is rarely dramatic. It emerges through small shifts that accumulate slowly, often unnoticed within a single lifetime. Population size, flexibility, and environmental rhythm interact quietly, shaping outcomes without announcing them. Survival, in this light, appears conditional rather than earned. It depends on timing as much as capability. When conditions remain within familiar bounds, life continues smoothly. When they shift beyond those bounds, continuation becomes uncertain. No amount of refinement prevents this. No success secures permanence. This understanding tempers how the present is viewed. Humanity today occupies a particular alignment supported by current conditions. That alignment feels stable because it is ongoing, not because it is assured. The same processes that shaped earlier histories remain in motion, indifferent to awareness or preference. Their story matters because it resists simplification. It does not fit neatly into narratives of ascent or replacement. It shows a form of humanity shaped carefully by its world, thriving within it, and then gradually finding itself less aligned as circumstances changed. Nothing about this trajectory implies deficiency or inevitability. It reflects how life responds when conditions evolve. In observing this, attention shifts from outcomes to processes. The focus moves away from who remained and toward how remaining happens at all. Persistence emerges as something maintained moment by moment, rather than secured by past success. This perspective encourages restraint. It places humanity within a broader biological context where continuity is rare and endings are common. It underscores that survival is not a fixed state, but a temporary condition upheld by ongoing fit between life and its surroundings. There is no need to draw lessons forward aggressively. The value lies in clarity, not instruction. Their history offers a quiet reference point, showing what happens when adaptation becomes deeply tuned to a world that later changes its rhythm. What remains unfinished is the awareness this creates. The story does not close with reassurance or warning. It lingers as an acknowledgement that humanity has always lived close to its limits. Those limits are shaped externally, not chosen internally, and they continue to exist regardless of recognition. In this calm reflection, their story stays open, not as a conclusion about the past, but as a reminder that the conditions supporting life are never static, and that survival has always rested on ground that can shift slowly beneath even the most enduring forms. The story returns most naturally to its beginning, to a time before labels and endings, when humanity existed as a set of possibilities rather than a single outcome. Neanderthals emerge here not as a conclusion, but as a response, shaped patiently by the conditions that surrounded them. Their form did not arise from destiny or error, but from alignment with a demanding world that rewarded particular balances of strength, endurance, and familiarity. They were shaped, not steered, each trait carried forward because it worked in the moment it appeared. Bodies adapted to cold and effort. Social structures adjusted to constraint and cooperation. Knowledge accumulated where it mattered most. None of this pointed toward disappearance. It pointed toward survival under specific circumstances that held steady for a very long time. When those circumstances changed, the response was not planned or avoided. Evolution does not store intent or preserve futures. It reacts to what exists now, reshaping life through pressure rather than foresight. The narrowing that occurred was not a path chosen, but a path formed, built slowly through repeated adjustment. What followed was not collapse, but transition, unfolding over time without a clear boundary. Focusing on origins rather than extinction softens the frame. It reveals how much of this story is about becoming rather than ending. Neanderthals were not moving toward disappearance any more than other lineages were moving toward persistence. Each was adjusting to local realities, shaped by chance, timing, and environment. Evolution did not aim toward us. It responded to conditions that allowed one lineage to continue when others slowly faded. This perspective restores quiet wonder. It shows how complex outcomes can emerge from simple processes repeated over immense spans of time. Small variations, carried forward under pressure, produced entire ways of life. Nothing needed to be designed, nothing needed to be corrected. Life adjusted, again and again, within the limits it inherited. Their story invites reflection without instruction. It does not ask for judgment or comparison. It offers a lens through which to view humanity as part of a larger pattern, shaped by the same forces that govern all life on Earth. Persistence appears provisional. Adaptation appears contextual. Survival appears delicate rather than guaranteed. In closing this passage, the emphasis remains on continuity rather than conclusion. The human story did not narrow toward a single endpoint. It passed through many forms, most of which are no longer visible, yet remain present in subtle ways. What exists now carries traces of what came before, shaped by reactions to worlds that no longer exist. If this reflection has opened space for curiosity, you are welcome to linger with it. Quiet thoughts, shared reflections, and gentle discussion keep these stories alive in a different way. Exploring human history together, calmly and attentively, allows these deep pasts to remain part of the present, not as answers, but as ongoing reminders of how life becomes what it is, moment by moment, under a world that never stops changing.